So we have three categories: interpersonal issues, organizational issues, and spiritual or theological issues. Interpersonal issues deal with the responsibilities that I feel towards an individual. So, for example, if the four people here, the four of us five of us were having a meeting, and all of a sudden you burst out in tears. I could decide, are we going to go on with the meeting, or am I going to stop and pay attention to what's obviously some kind of an emotional concern for you? My interpersonal set of responsibilities would say that I need to ignore the 99 and pay attention to the 1. I need to just ignore everybody else and pay attention to you. The organizational part of me would say, I've got a job to do here. We're trying to have a meeting. I'll deal with him later. What's the right answer? There is no right answer. What we're describing here is what are called competing commitments. You're going to feel pulled in more than one direction at a time. And so the temptation at that moment is just to pick one and just solve that problem. Normally it would be just the crying problem, and ignore everything else. You're going to feel, though, later that there's a problem because you never got the things you needed done organizationally. The question that you're going to ask yourself again and again is, how do I balance three kinds of issues? Interpersonal or emotional issues, organizational or communal issues, and spiritual and theological issues. So let's talk together about this particular case. Describe for me name for me an interpersonal or anything that's going on you think here. Anybody jump out at you?
Angela, have you not talked to Jill before she made a purchase of new curriculum material?
So one of the things that you're going to be concerned about is what's best for Angela. One of the things you're going to be concerned about is what's best for Gil. You don't get to just pick one, oh, this one's my favorite. But you mentioned something else. You mentioned about rather than write out Sunday school director, can I just put Sun school director? Can you read this? Peter, can you read this in the back? I have a tendency to write smaller and smaller to the point where no one can read it. Okay, the Sunday school director did not consult the treasurer. You'll notice how over here she's Angela, and over here she's the Sunday school director. Why is that? Because here we're paying attention to who she is as a person. Here we're focusing on her role. And oftentimes what you're going to find is that any individual's person and role are in conflict with each other. Okay? So let's start with Angela. What are your interpersonal or emotional concerns? If you want to be pastor to Angela, what are the things that you care about in this moment? Anything come to mind? Okay. So you want to make sure that she gets heard. Are you inferring that she is not presently being heard? I mean. At the end, it feels like she's going to be dismissed. Okay. Okay. So one of the things you're looking at is dismissed. And that's a conclusion that you're drawing, but at the same time, you're trying to pay attention to that. Okay? Here and then there.
And I'm not sure whether it's a spiritual issue or interpersonal, but I want to make sure that Angela is moving on what she's being called by God to do. So was she being called to Bible materials? That's the right spiritual thing? Or was that a personal thing? What was that about?
You'll notice that some things fit, I'm not sure you can see that, but some things fit in more than one category. If I'm reading you correctly, you're not talking about her individual call as terms of I'm called to be Sunday school director. You're talking about what is God asking you to do in this very moment. And so this is typically called discernment. Is that the thing that you're paying attention to here?
Yeah.
So if I had that book that Gwen Ingram had a moment ago where she talked about spiritual disciplines, there's a whole thing on discernment. That's a spiritual discipline. what we call spiritual discipline of discernment in the organizational realm is often called decision making. And so part of what you're also asking is, did she follow the right processes in doing the decision? So on the one hand, we're asking her to make sure she's responding to God. On the other hand, we're asking to make sure that she's following the right procedures. Because, well, in most of our traditions, you don't get to simply say, I know we have rules, but God told me. And if you do say, I know we have rules, but God told me, there's even a process for dealing with that. I mean, in charismatic Pentecostal traditions, that's true. Let me finish one thing up, and then we're going to go there and then there. Part of what I hear you saying behind that is not just that we have to pay attention to decision making, but who has the authority to make the decision here? I believe that there are at least two groups that have claimed authority. So we'll get to that in a moment. You want to say something?
My original thought was talking about, is Angela's superintendent, is this her authority?
Okay.
But the other thing I was going to say is that also, interpersonally, I can sense that Gil and people at the church are being pulled away from denominational loyalty. So they're kind of threatened. And I want to make sure that
Can I added the word fear. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah.
Because I think that part of what you mean by threatened is fear. I mean,
Right.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that part of what you were trying to say?
I mean, that's...
If it's not, I'll erase it.
No, that works too, but I was just thinking more threatened by her, and I guess it would also be the fear of losing that denominational identity. So
Well, and part of the reason I put fear is I didn't even say what they're afraid of. But when people are feeling fear, pay attention to that. Let me tell you why. The world's best slogan of any organization or commercial I've ever seen was from the American Lung Association. They work on lung cancer. And their slogan was, if you can't breathe, nothing else matters. It's a great slogan because it's absolutely, everybody can jump into that moment. You know exactly what that's like. They're saying our cause is more important than your cause because, well, if you can't breathe, nothing else matters. Well, I would argue that when you feel fear, it's hard for anything else to matter. As a matter of fact, especially when you feel fear, it is hard to listen to anybody else. It's hard to make anybody else's issues important. Fear makes people selfish. It's not that they're selfish in that they're a jerk. It's selfish in that they're putting their own interests of not having whatever thing they fear happen, that it jumps out in them. And so fearful people aren't necessarily rational people. Now, the stereotype at that moment is to say, okay, you're feeling this fear. Your fear is irrational. Get over it and go back to being a rational person. Can we just agree up front that we're not going to be telling people to, that just telling somebody not to be afraid isn't going to work? Ask any angel that's ever appeared in the Bible. What's the required first words out of the mouth of every angel? Whatever else angels look like, they must be really scary because they always have to say that. And how's that work for them? People go, oh great, I'm glad you said that. I'm no longer afraid. Just telling somebody to get over it is not going to be enough. But if you're going to care for Gil, you're going to have to pay attention to his fear and not ignore it. So we've got, in the blue, what's your name? Natasha, and then what's your name?
Brittany.
So we'll go Natasha and then Brittany.
Just reading through this, I see another entity for the board.
Mm-hmm.
And the Sunday school teachers meeting. And so it seems like there's a discrepancy between who's the liaison from the teachers meeting to making decisions financially. And it almost seems like Gil is controlling the board with the financial aspect of that control.
So I heard a couple of things. One of the things that you said was that there are two different groups that seem to have authority to make decisions, the board and the teachers, and that one of the kinds of decisions they end up having to make are financial decisions. And so each of them claim that they've got some authority there. But I think...
My question was about the Sunday school director. Is the confusion, is she supposed to be a liaison between the teachers meeting and take the information they decide at the teachers meeting to the board before making those decisions?
So we've got the treasurer who is on financial decisions, the person for the board. And so part of what you're asking, I think, is who has the, what is her duty? What is her responsibility in this moment? And what I can answer for you is that is actually subject to some particular debate. Because it's about who has the authority not just to make financial decisions, but to decide on curriculum. If you were to, if we were to pull out, there's a longer version of this, about 4 pages long. If we were to pull out the bylaws of the church, you would find that the teachers' meeting is endowed with the authority to make decisions about curriculum. And it says that the board will have authority over all decisions that are made in the congregation. So who has the authority? It's not clear. It's one where each side can say, I'm the last word. And so now what are you going to do in this moment when, appealing, each side, it's not, we've all seen those moments when both sides are wrong. In this particular case, each side's got a legitimate claim. Each side's right. Now what are we going to do? You're going to say?
Observation was that Gil pulled both from the congregational power play and the spiritual in his appeal.
So how did he? What spiritual did he do?
He called the curriculum she chose fundamentally.
Ah. Okay. Did Angela make any kind of a theological claim or anything about the curriculum as well? What did she say?
She said that it was more salvation or Christ-centered.
Christ-centered. So not only does the teachers' meeting have a different claim than the board, that Angela has a different theological perspective on the curriculum than Gil does. So we've got a theological debate now going on here. Brittany, what do you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the interpersonal side of it. I think that the organizational issues would have prevented a lot of the problem, but again, the pastor needs to notice that Gil is, as Natasha used the word, controlling, and there's dysfunction going on within the board by the way he spoke out, by the way his outburst. So that's an interpersonal issue, just specifically to him. And then the sentences after that suggest that there's been like a history of this problem. So he constantly has outbursts, and then his quickness to make the decision sort of smooth it over. And the fact that everyone nods in agreement, suggests that he is has kind of a controlling, strong personality, and that the rest of the board has been enabling this. And so that's a really serious thing that she needs to think about too. So again, like part of the organizational things about communicating who has authority to make what decision would help with that, but then it is kind of a personality.
Can I play with this a little? Is that okay? Because one of the things I want to talk about is before, right here where we erased it, where we talked about the difference in directly observable data and inferences. Some of the statements that you made, I'm not going to actually disagree with, but I do want to suggest that they were inferences or interpretations. Like, so when you said controlling, or when you said the board is enabling, the board gives control to Gil on certain issues. That's a directly observable data. But the fact that you then said if they do that habitually, that is enabling this behavior. I don't disagree with that, but I want to signal for you that that's actually an inference, and this is the kind of thing that we can get in trouble with if we don't just pay attention to the difference. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, just kind of the sense where it talks about the nervous laughter suggested the folks had come to expect his little tirades. that's a kind of a key sentence because when someone's expecting and then when it's described as a tirade, how is that?
Sure. The word tirade. The word tirade right there is an inference.
I see what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, it's an inference. That it could say, the board is used to his righteous indignation. And that would be a interpretation that said he was right. A tirade is something that says he was probably wrong. So just the way that it is written does not do a good job separating directly observable data from the inferences that we draw from it. Because we act as if our inferences are facts. That's the thing that we have to be really careful about. We treat the conclusions that we draw as if they are the fact that was true all along. There's two people in the back there, their hands up. Oh, what's your name?
Ashton.
Okay, you go first.
I think one of the biggest problems here is that you don't have a leadership position, someone taking control of the situation to make a decision. And that would be, in this case, I think would be the pastor's role, step in and make a decision one way or the other. And base that decision on the evidence given from both sides.
So one of the things that you're asking is not only about the authority of the board or the authority of the teachers meeting, but what's the authority of the pastor? In some, there was no definitive authority. There was a ton of authority in the room. Everybody was saying it's all about me. But one of the things that you're saying is that you're advocating for a position that says that when there is a debate, that the pastor's job is to come in and to decide on behalf of everyone else. I mean, is that what you're saying, or? Because when you said take control, I am drawing an inference from what you said, and so I'm now giving you the right to change that.
That's fine. And I'm not going to change it too much. I just think that there has to be a definitive authority role or you're not going to get anywhere. I mean, these two sides could argue forever and never come to a conclusion because they're both holding firm and they believe in why they're presenting the material, both sides. So I think if you had a pastor step in, present both sides of the, of the argument, and then present why he or she feels one way or the other is the best for the church.
Well, and that's going to end up being a theological assertion. Because in some theological traditions, what you just said is absolutely the theologically right way to go. And in other traditions, that would be considered theologically inappropriate for the pastor to step in that way. So this is one of those moments where I don't, we need to go around the room and introduce our, I don't know what your theological tradition is. So you could be advocating for something that's absolutely within your theological tradition or something that violates your tradition. I'm not going to ask you to tell me. But I want you to notice that statements about the pastor's role are by definition theological about when we talk about what kind of authority they have. Peter, do you have your hand up?
Just a minor observation. So I think I know we're doing a lot of inferences. I think something that might help fill in the blanks is also to kind of observe also Hattie.
Okay, Hattie. Yes. Turns out there's another person.
I think it's interesting that her role is that she appears to have been in the teacher's meeting
Uh-huh.
and at the same time is on the board. And the fact that she interrupted Gil, there's an interruption there, so you're kind of wondering about her words. What's her role or what's her play in this situation as well? And then organizationally, it comes to kind of what we were talking about, decision making. Who has that power? How does that work?
See, one of the things that you just brought up is really an interesting moment because you bring up Hattie as if, because she bridges a bunch of gaps. And she seems to have some kind of authority to interrupt Gil that nobody else seems comfortable doing, and she does. Yet when I go to write her name over here, I can't draw on any kind of a role in the organization that gives her that authority. It's not her role in the organization that gives her that authority. It is something that comes out of her person. It's going to be what, when you take a leadership class, you're going to talk about cultural authority. There's a difference between structural authority and cultural authority. Structural authority is something assigned to you in a job description. We can look and see what's the structural authority of the treasurer. Cultural authority comes from something that's handed over to you from individuals. So for example, in many of your traditions, you have something that says respect your elders. And so just by being older than Gil, she may have some authority. But so you're asking yourself, wait a second, as I'm listing all these options, it may be that Hattie is an interesting option because she's outside the decision-making process and she's utterly involved in this decision-making process. She's kind of a bridge figure. There's a hand up over here and then here.
I know, kind of piggyback off the pastor's role comment, depending on your background, but there has to be some sort of, I mean, just by definition of the fact that it is a board, some sort of chairman of the board, whether that is the pastor or
Sure.
whether that is someone else. So where, I mean, as of right now, reading this case study, you would think that Gil is the chairman of the board and the treasurer.
Well, in this particular case, I can answer that for you. The pastor is the chair of the board, but that doesn't actually answer very much for you. Because in various traditions, the pastor being the chair of the board means the pastor speaks a lot and then tells the board what to do. Or in other traditions, that means the pastor is the facilitator that makes sure everybody else speaks. As a matter of fact, in my own tradition, a Presbyterian tradition, which has more definitive organizational guidance than just about all of your traditions combined, we do committees right. You know, what's that? Yes, yes, we do lots of them. It's not clear that the outcome's very good. But I can tell you what the role of a chair is supposed to be, and I can't answer this question for you about the chair here, because various Presbyterian pastors, some will take and set up a dynamic with their board where they participate in the debate, and some will set up a dynamic that they don't. But what's really interesting is that at no point in the whole thing do you see Claire speak. What's that? So one of the questions is whether or not she's going to take on any role, whether it's a facilitating role or an authoritarian role. One would think it would involve speaking. Say something. So when this case is written this way, I purposely made it so that she didn't say anything. And then, because I wanted you to be in a place where you said, okay, the next words out of anyone's mouth better be from Claire. Because she's gone on too long being silent. And I want this to be like Claire has written this. Now I said somebody else could go next, but I don't remember who it was. Oh, you were next.
Hattie seems to be on both the teaching meeting and the board.
Yes.
So why didn't she tell the board about this before? Or it seems like this is brand new, but she knew it and should have backed her up more.
See, this is a good moment where our instinct is to say, okay, who's to blame here? Well, the first person we can blame is Gil. Oh, no, wait, no, we can blame Angela. Oh, wait, we can blame Hattie. We could actually blame Claire because she didn't speak. Okay, every person whose name appears on this page, we could construct a way of interpreting this to say it was their fault. Because what's happened is this community has to take responsibility. Your job when you lead a group is to say, how do I construct an environment for this community to thrive? Not just how do I act on their behalf.
Yeah, I wasn't blaming her.
No, okay, I'm sorry, then I misinterpreted you.
I was just thinking if she had been more talkative in the meeting.
Sure, she could have started. There was a moment she could have jumped in and helped Angela. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to look for a couple of more things, 3 people, and then we're going to try and move forward. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. So you're first, you're second, and you're third.
I personally see in the church, there are 2 types of people. People who are the board, seems to be in the description they're much older.
Okay. I'm going to put them over here because you're going to start describing these people. So one of the things that you're going to say is that they're older. What else?
And then younger people that are listening after the board.
Uh-huh.
And there seems to be a conflict of values.
Yes. What are the values for this group?
Tradition, denomination.
So they value the denomination and its traditions. Okay, what about this group here? What you said there's a conflict of values. What's this group going to value?
Teaching of salvation, Christ-centeredness.
Okay, so probably I think part of what you're saying is they don't value the denomination. You know, whatever, it's not that they're opposed to it, but that's not one of their big values. And theologically, this group is interested in salvation. Is there any other theological commitments that we see from this group? Shepherds are not. It's not shepherds and angels at Christmas. What are the things that they're interested in? Hunger, some kind of social action, something like that. So we've got this group that tends to seem to fall into this category, and this group that tends to fall into this category. You look like you really want to say something.
I'm confused as why you're putting it underneath the fundamentalists, because Gil was saying he was against the fundamentalists.
Yeah. The key, I'm sorry, I was not clear on that. Your question is, why did I put this under the fundamentalists? Because Gil was the one that, quote, said fundamentalists. So the people that would say, you know, this is, we'll call this Gil's group. And one of the words that they would speak is the word fundamentalist, and that's why it's in quotes. And one of the words that this group would speak, we call it Angela's group, is they would speak the words Christ-centered. So that's why I did that. But why did I put this under theological categories? Because older is not a theological category. Because I don't think. Because one of the things that often happens with this is often this category becomes about culture. What you believe shapes how you act. And it becomes, are you comfortable talking about how there's different cultures within a congregation? Different groups of people that tend to think alike? And so when we talk about beliefs and values, we end up naming something that's a cultural category. And so this ends up also being a cultural category. And I would argue that what you've done, what was your name? I'm sorry. What was your name? One of the things Peter just did is he identified two cultural groups. There's this cultural group and this cultural group. And that whatever else is going on, we don't have just a debate about authority, and we don't have just a debate between individuals. We have a debate between cultural groups. And so if you were the kind of person that only paid attention to organizational stuff, you'd say, oh, this is all about authority. If you were the kind of person that only paid attention to relationships, you'd say, oh, this is all about relationships. If you were the only person that only fit in this category, you'd say, oh, this is only about culture. Which of those is right? All three of them are right. And so here's the dirty little secret. In order to solve or help address issues in one of these categories, you often have to make things worse in one of the other categories. So if I'm only going to pay attention to the interpersonal stuff, that's going to actually make it harder to solve the theological stuff. Or if I'm only going to pay attention to the organizational, it makes it harder to do the interpersonal. And you're called to do all three at the same time. How do you do that? That's part of the reason why it's so hard. And so one of the things I talked to you about is how it's easy to look at this and make a rookie mistake. The rookie mistake you would make is to say, okay, it's either all about relationships, or, oh, I see what this is about. This is all about authority. Or, wait, I see what this is all about. It's about theology. And not see that there are multiple perspectives in play and that you have to balance all of those out. Now, I named two other people that got to speak, and now I've lost them. Were you one of them? What's your name? Patrick.
Both Angela and Gil are making the assumption that their particular cultural group represents the entire church.
Yes.
And they're fairly pejorative, whether directly or indirectly, pejorative of the other group. Because saying something's Christ-centered is assuming that the other culture is not Christ-centered, and fundamentalist propaganda is fairly directly pejorative.
One of the things that Patrick just reminded us is that each cultural group is not just saying, I am one among many cultural groups, let me tell you about my particular perspective. They just think this is how it should be. And it's not that they're being jerks by saying that I have singled out others who I want to oppress. They're just thinking there is right and there is wrong. If you think that something is fundamentalist and judgmental, well, it's not that you're thinking that you're trying to oppose that person. You're trying to stop the church from being fundamentalist and judgmental. If you want something to be Christ-centered, you think that's a good thing. You're advocating for something you think is good. It's not that you think that there are multiple perspectives here. And one of the tricky things for a leader in this kind of a moment is you have to be more aware of what's going on than the people in the room are. That you have to recognize that there are these two groups, and you have to recognize that these groups will not see themselves as individual groups. They will see the entire church through that light. And who was the third person? Was you the third person?
I'm not a third person. It seems like you're making a conclusion based on that, though.
What do you mean?
When you're talking about that, you're making the assumption that the one statement or the one situation speaks for all situations with that individual, too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just like somebody votes Democrat and doesn't necessarily agree with everything a Democrat Party endorses.
Great. What's your name?
Brian.
Brian makes a great point. One of the things that we'll spend time talking about in leadership classes is how to treat your own conclusions as hypotheses rather than as conclusions. What I just said was, it seems, what I stated a conclusion, and because I know the larger version of this, I can back it up, but that's based on data you don't have in the room. And so Patrick Brian, sorry, that was Patrick over there. Brian is correctly saying, wait a second, how do you know that? You've just treated your own conclusion as if it was a fact. Well, what you'd have to do in this kind of a moment, if you were leading this group, is you'd say, okay, how can I find out if there's basically a center of gravity where this group kind of mostly thinks that, and this group kind of mostly thinks that. Not every single person over here is always over here. But let's put it this way. If I were to talk about, say, Christianity, which is something you might know a little bit about, and tell you one set of beliefs somebody has. So, for example, you come across somebody on the bus, and you're driving along, you're riding along on the bus, and you turn to somebody next to you, and you say, what's up? And they start talking, and they say to you, I believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. Are there any other conclusions that you can probably hypothesize they also believe in? So, for example, what do you think they believe about the ordination of women? They would likely be opposed to it. There are inerrants who are in favor of the ordination of women, but not many. What tends to happen is beliefs come in bundles. And so what you would do if you were talking to that person on the bus is you would hypothesize where they were going without putting them in a little box that they could never escape from. I have a person that I regularly deal with who is in a denomination that is very conservative on like 97% of the issues. But on one particular set of issues, immigration, they are not where you would predict a conservative group would be. And if I just treated them like they were like every other group, I would misinterpret them. So what I had to do was listen to them enough to know that on 97% of the issues they're here, and on this particular issue they're over there. That's how so you deal with it as a hypothesis. What I've just done is I've told you that, remember we talked before about how there are certain things you learn to pay attention to and certain things you can safely ignore? One of the things that I've told you to pay attention to now is, do beliefs and values come in bundles? And if you can find things about somebody in your church that believes that, they probably believe these other things as well. And so what I've done is activate for you this question of looking for bundles. But I'm also saying that you've got to be sure to treat that as a hypothesis that you test, that you investigate, rather than a conclusion that you can trust. Now, we can keep going, and we could, but I'm not going to. I want to introduce one more conversation, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example of how one way that you could deal with this, which is specifically not to say the only way to deal with it. When you're dealing with cases, or when you're dealing with trying to figure out what to do next, I would argue that there's three categories of what to do next you have to pay attention to. Short-term options, medium-term options, and long-term. So if, say, we're sitting in a meeting and one of the conclusions you draw is we need to raise enough money to build a new youth center. Is that going to be a short-term or a medium-term or a long-term kind of a pursuit? That's probably long-term. That's probably not something you can do right there in the room. And what if we're dealing with our friend here who's crying? Is that going to be a long-term thing? Next, Christmas time, I'll deal with that. If you don't deal with it in the short term, it probably is lost. So there's some issues that gravitate towards short term, some medium, some long term. Let me give you one way of addressing all the issues here. It's not the only way. What I would argue is the next words out of Claire's mouth, the next words out of the pastor's mouth, need to be about Angela. My short term, my immediate response is I need to, and what I would say, protect Angela. Because where she's at the end of this statement is it looks like Gil has trampled her. And that she came in with all the right motivations, and she just got smacked. And I've got to make sure that she doesn't feel like the board meeting is an unsafe place. Because right now it would be easy for her. My hypothesis, she hasn't said a word. What's it say? Angela's face was hard to read. So there's no data that you have here. My inference, my hypothesis would be that Angela feels like that whatever Gil did was mean, that was difficult, that it was hard on her. And so the first thing I would do is figure out, how do I protect her? I'll give you an example of how to do that in a minute. One of my medium-term goals, and I'd have more than one, would be to deal with Gil and his outbursts. In the longer version of this, you find that this is not the first time Gil has had an outburst, and this is not the first time that the pastor has had to talk to him about his outbursts. Because, now, there's two reasons that as a pastor I care about this. One is they're bad for the congregation. But more importantly, they're bad for Gil. That this is not a good Christian way to go through life. And that what I want to do is not reprimand him or scold him. I want to enter into a conversation with him where he can discover that this is bad behavior, and we can work together on making sure that it changes behavior. He's a grown-up. He's not a 7-year-old. I don't get to just simply tell him what to do. And if I do, he'll only do it when I'm looking. But if I can help him discover this is wrong, and then help him work with him so that he can choose to do what was right, that's a much better way to go. So my medium-term solution or issue with Gil is to try and get him to change these outbursts. Yeah?
I said that's true for the 7-year-old too.
Well, it's probably true of the 7-year-old too, you're right. At the organizational realm, my immediate response, my short-term response, is to try to get Angela's curriculum approved without setting precedent. What I want to do is I want to separate Angela's question from the larger question of who has authority. So what I would do is I would identify for the group the question of who has authority is actually up for grabs here. That the bylaws of the church give the teachers meeting the authority to make this decision, and the bylaws of the church give the board the authority to make this decision. It's not that either one tried to steal authority from the other. We've got an issue we've got to work on. And I would say, now is probably not the time to work on it. Because this curriculum has been bought, because this group has acted in good faith, can we just let them go ahead and move forward? And see, so what I'm doing is I'm using my authority not to demand a result, but to suggest something and then see how they run with it. And so try and get them to separate the issue of curriculum from precedent, get them to approve the curriculum, And then for the medium term, say we're going to need to work on the authority question. And then I would recommend a process for how we would go about it. So I wouldn't just say someday down the line we're going to have to work on the authority question. I would say what I'd like to suggest that we do, and then name the process that we would use to work on that. So that what it looks like isn't just that I'm tabling this issue, but I'm actually giving it legs. I'm saying this is something we're going to work on. We're not sweeping this under the rug. Because the temptation is to say, okay, we're not setting precedent, we're just going to move on. It's going to feel to Gil like, okay, he just got trampled on. But if we say, we're going to work on this question, and here's who's, and then what I would say in this process is I would make sure that Gil understood that there was a place for him in this process. Otherwise, it would be very easy for Gil to feel like he was being trampled on. So those are my short and medium term issues here. Any questions on that? Yeah.
I have a question. It's not clear from reading whether or not Angela had discussed the new curriculum change with Claire.
Jen.
And it's also not clear where Claire stands on the theological issue. So my question would it be appropriate for Claire as the pastor of this church, who we would assume is steeped in the theological tradition, to make a statement at that point about the theological issue and kind of address an interpersonal at the same time?
That's a great segue, because we haven't actually talked about how we're going to deal with this issue. But, oh, Jeff, you want to say something?
Yeah, it's just, maybe I'm missing something, but I know you're saying that this is one solution of possibly many, but it seems like your short-term solution is making the assumption that Angela's curriculum is the way to go.
Okay, both of you are asking the question, theologically, how does the pastor feel about her curriculum? I'm going to assume for this purpose that neither curriculum, neither the denominational curriculum nor the one that the teachers' meeting came up with is theologically dangerous. Neither one of them is theologically dangerous. And I'm distinguishing between do I agree with from is it theologically dangerous? Because of the decision-making role that I have as a pastor. I have two choices. I can trust the organization, or I can say no decision gets made without me revisiting it. So if I jump in and I say that on this particular issue, I have to decide whether the curriculum is theologically appropriate, that means that now and forever, every time anybody picks anything, I've got to pass muster on it theologically. I don't have that kind of time. I probably don't have that kind of wisdom. That is a thoroughly appropriate Catholic response. So if you have an apostolic authority as part of your theology, then the only arbiter of theological decisions should be the person who is handed that kind of apostolic authority. But apart from that, if you're in a Protestant tradition, you probably don't want to set yourself up as the only theological authority, because we believe in the priesthood of all believers. And at that point, it becomes very hard for me to justify theologically that I am the only theological reference. So what I'd have to say is, do I believe that either of these is dangerous? Let's assume that I believe that neither of the curricula is dangerous. And so at that point, then I say, okay, what's best for this apart from the theological danger? The best is to say, I want to trust the teachers' meeting because they went to such effort and because they are bucking Gil's, the weight of his tirade. Because one of the things that we haven't talked much about here, that other groups have talked a lot about, is that Gil has made a precedent-setting statement that the treasurer has veto power over all purchases. He says, I would never have approved that. Whoa. Do any of your churches have any kind of a treasurer that has veto power over all purchases? I mean, nobody has that. So he was claiming for himself something that nobody wants him to have. So I want to try and let the organization reside where the bylaws said it should, that this belongs to the board and the teachers' meeting. Gil was trying to take it for himself. And whatever else we can agree on, we can agree that it's not just Gil's choice. And that's why I wanted to move and end up with that curriculum. So the question becomes, how do we deal with this cultural divide? And I would argue at that point that that is my long-term thing. That's my long-term goal. And the most important thing that I learned in this conversation, when I work, if I'm the pastor and this is happening, is not about Hattie and Gil, or Angela, and is not about authority. It's about the division that defines my congregation. Go back to that first paragraph. What it talks about is how this church was once this way, and now all this new stuff is going on. All this new life that she's so excited about. Congregations that experience new life are often dangerous. Because what's happened is those that are tied into the new life feel like we're the congregation. And those who are not part of that new story feel like we're the congregation and we're getting left behind. And so part of what I have to do is figure out, how do I get these groups that are presently separated to become more tied together? And here's how, I'll give you the very short-term version of how I would do that. I would define a third theological space. I would use my sermons and other things to talk about ways that can talk about both hunger and salvation, so that they are not in conflict with each other. Something that appeals to tradition, but that doesn't always have to be denominational. Something that allows, that is opposed to the strident fundamentalism, but still emphasizes Jesus. That's what I would try and build here. And I would invite each group to step into that space. Right now, they are separate. And so the thing that I would learn from this is that my long-term goal is a theological one. And that the only person that can build that is me as the pastor. Because one of the few things that you have advantage that every one of you leads something. I mean, that's what you're assigned to do in some kind of a internship. You get to speak to group. Is there anybody here whose internship requires them never to speak?
I'm looking for that one.
Because you have voice, you have the ability to create theological and moral categories that can change the way people see the world. And that's the most powerful thing that comes with ministry. That's what Claire's goal is right here. This went way too fast. I didn't get a chance to, everybody wanted to speak. I apologize for that. What I wanted to do is illustrate a bunch of different ways that we can go about this. So the things that you can see are, always have these three categories. Always ask what's short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And always deal with the fact that these are competing commitments. And you're always going to have to struggle between, if I do this one, it makes it hard to do this one. Any last comments, questions, rebuttals? Then let me pray for you. God, I thank you that you have privileged each of us with your Spirit. You have planted your Spirit within us. You have not called us to be adequate. You have called us to respond to that Spirit, because it's only through that Spirit that we work in our world, and as you work through our weakness. Allow that Spirit you've planted within us to respond to the Spirit you've planted within all those entrusted to our care, that we may bring glory and honor to your name. Amen. Thanks a lot. Yeah.